Info on the next expansion, rotation, and new year is almost here. So again, I'm going through and looking at some of the most important kind of vital cards that will be rotating out of standard when the rotation happens. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at Paladin and Priest cards. Now, kind of opposite, I think, for Paladin than how I felt for Druid. I don't feel like there's a ton of Paladin cards that are leaving that are incredibly impactful and have created entire archetypes. So let's take a look at these. Of course, first, quest lines and hero cards are leaving, so we're going to be taking a look at those. So the quest line for Paladin is this Rise to the Occasion for playing 1-cost cards. And then you'd eventually get to the point of playing that Lightborn Cariel at the end. And for the rest of your game, your Silverhand recruits had +2/+2. There was a couple of weeks maybe where people really were trying to get this to work. It never really did. It just probably was the weakest, honestly, one of the weakest of the quest lines. And just never really had enough of a reward, enough payoff for it to be played more. On the other side of that, though, is the hero card. And this is one of the most incredibly powerful hero cards, like Lightforged Cariel here, dealing 2 to all enemies. Didn't seem like that much, but honestly often did clear entire boards. And then that 2/5 immovable object that opponents could only do half damage once this Cariel was down, unless that weapon was removed. There was one point that Restaurant Viper was being used because of this card. And yeah, this has just been one of the... Honestly, this is probably the biggest card for Paladin that it's losing this rotation. This hero card has been incredibly impactful over the last 2 years and has really kind of created a new way for Paladin to survive, to stay in games, but also the hero power of giving a minion in your hand +4/+4. There was a little bit of time where that also became an entire win condition for some Paladin decks as well. Now, again, I mentioned that it feels like Paladin isn't really losing that much impactful stuff, but I do still want to highlight some cards that at least did see some play. The first is kind of this secret little package that they had here with Sword of the Fallen and the 2 secrets, Galloping Savior and Judgment of Justice. Justice used a little bit now and then. Savior was used a bit in that more secret Paladin a little while ago. But these cards definitely still around, and Galloping Savior created, especially I think that one in particular, for a lot of people, was something that you had to think about and play around often against these Paladin secrets. Not even just in Paladin, but in other classes that could pick up secrets as well. There was, again, that short time where a secret Paladin was around, so that Northwatch Commander to draw a minion and that Cannon Master were used for a little bit of time, kind of early on in this set of expansions, but again, didn't really last very long, so just wanted to highlight those. On the other hand, though, these next several cards, I will say, I definitely feel like saw a lot more play. First one here, Conviction, the ranked spell. All the ranked spells came out in Forged in the Barrens, so those will all be leaving. But the ranked spell Conviction here was used quite a bit in some aggressive burst style Paladins, especially in combination with things like Battleground Battlemaster, which is also rotating. But there was a point where that was definitely used quite a bit, and yeah, that impactful for sure. Then the next one is Cariel Realm. Of course, you gotta mention all of the Cariel versions here. This was such a good mid-game minion that it actually ended up in quite a few different Paladin decks, Paladin archetypes over its time in Standard. Being able to rush and have a Divine Shield immediately impact the board, and because of that immediate board impact, sometimes it was played even without really a consideration for that discount to holy spells. It was even right now, I would say, in the classy Paladin, the deck that just uses all class cards, really doesn't run holy spells, or really just one. So oftentimes this just ends up being an immediate board impact card, and that's often good enough. So incredible impact there as well. And this last one here, Knight of Anointment, a battle cry effect that draws you a holy spell. I would say oftentimes any kind of very specific draw in Hearthstone is very, very good. That kind of tutor effect, if you're familiar with Magic, that draw a very specific thing from the deck, very, very good. And some decks really capitalized on that with only running 1 or 2 holy spells, or at one point when Librams were around, they were also running this to draw a lot of those Librams and get those synergies going. Now, also with that, talking about very specific draw, the other one I have to mention is Alliance Bannerman. That draws a minion, and then all minions in your hand get +1/+1. Again, used in quite a few Paladin decks. It was used in that kind of more aggressive, bursty style deck. It was used at one point just farther down just to draw some minions. Used even in things like Mech Paladin. So very, very popular card to use. But again, it's because of that very specific draw style. And, you know, a bonus there for buffing minions as well. Now, these next two here, I think were pretty used kind of off and on, not necessarily in a lot of decks like the last couple of cards, but Righteous Defense and City Tax here, both also rotating. Again, everything with that tradable also leaving. Righteous Defense and City Tax have been some kind of defensive style tools, reactive style tools that more kind of mid-range or control style Paladins have used. These don't usually get run in like the more aggressive Paladins that we've seen, but not only just great inclusions in decks, but also pretty fantastic cards to have picked up off of Discover effects, and Righteous Defense also being a holy spell. Just a lot going on there. That tradable to dig in your deck for something else if you don't need the City Tax. Those definitely saw a decent chunk of play. Now, these next set of cards really relied on Divine Shields, and I'm talking things like this Prismatic Jewel Kit and a little bit of High Lord Fordragon. High Lord Fordragon wasn't really added in a ton of decks, but it saw a little bit of play every now and then. But the Prismatic Jewel Kit did see some play in a couple of different decks, most notably the more aggressive kind of burst style Paladin and Mech Paladin style decks, along with the Divine Shield kind of synergy and buffing. There were also a couple of targeted spells with Noble Mount and Hold the Bridge. So these couple of cards give a minion Divine Shield. They kind of have that buff. Hold the Bridge, adding a bit of lifesteal. That was definitely played in kind of a variety of decks as well. And the last two for Paladin that I want to mention here that I think really saw a good chunk of play are Battle Vicar and this Stonehearth Vindicator. Battle Vicar, I don't think was used as much as the Vindicator, but Battle Vicar, discovering a holy spell, could generate some healing. It could generate some removal. Just a lot of options, and that 1/3 body was pretty decent on its own most of the time, and got even better, of course, if you were running hand buff or some of those targeted buff spells. But the Stonehearth Vindicator really used in a couple of different ways, I would say, over its time in Standard. One was getting to draw very specific targeted things, or those things like Hold the Bridge, or that Noble Mount that I already showed for the more aggressive Paladin. And then more recent expansions in the more recent metas really heavily used for pulling out specifically Order in the Courts. Now, when it comes to the Priest cards, I do think that Priest is losing quite a bit more of the kind of essence, I think, of many of the decks that have been in standard for Priest over the last 2 years. So, of course, again, in our fashion here, we are going to start with this quest line and hero card. So, quest, seek guidance for Priest. This kind of sequential on curve is what you hoped for when playing Quest Priest. You hoped you had these cards, but to be able to play certain cost cards and get that huge payoff at the end of finding this shard from your deck and just ending the game as soon as you play that, oftentimes didn't quite go that far in the game, but definitely this Quest Priest was something that was seen on and off all throughout the last 2 years in a variety of fashions. Definitely this quest was one of the more played, more notable quest lines from these sets. And then on the other side of that, the hero card here, Xyrella the Devout. Have to talk about her here, triggering the death rattle of every friendly minion that had died during the game. People used this in several different ways. I know people even tried this with like Boar Priest, but even just as part of either the Quest Priest or even in just some more like death rattle style focused decks. Some people tried it with some like undead synergies for some burst damage. There was just quite a few ways actually that people tried to use Xyrella, but a lot of value from Xyrella, and being able to then get the hero power from it as well, even if there wasn't a lot of death rattle value, is where Priest started to find a potential win condition at that later stage of the game with the alternating hero power of healing for 5 or dealing 5 damage. Talking about the death rattles, I think there's 3 pretty impactful death rattles here that Priest is losing with this rotation, and that is Undying Disciple, Spirit Guide, and the ever-popular Light Shower Elemental. These 3 minions used in a variety of decks, whether it was like a quest style deck or being able to just use those death rattles repetitively. The Light Shower Elemental and Undying Disciple especially very good, especially repetitive effects against more aggressive decks. A lot of ways that people were using these minions specifically, being able to revive them, and part of that reviving not only the hero card, but also the Amulet of Undying. That is, again, that tradable effect. All the tradable cards are leaving with this rotation. So yeah, being able to trade this off and increase that number of minions brought back. Again, used with those few death rattles I just showed, and also very prevalent in things like the Boar Priest as well. Another really important tradable card Priest is losing is Shard of the Naru. That tradable effect, incredibly strong, but also silencing enemy minions, used quite a bit in its time in standard over a variety of metas, whether it was the opponent playing death rattle effects or the opponent playing buffs, or even against other priests in the times of kind of the Naga wig, like OTK bless style priests as well. This Shard of the Naru, very versatile, and again, that tradable effect, really great for Priest to be able to dig and find answers. And speaking of that Bless Priest, these next 2 cards definitely made that Priest archetype a thing. And the first one is Bless itself. The second one is that Shadow Word Devour that really helped build up a large health on one minion to then be able to use the Bless and increase that attack. So yeah, both of these leaving as well. These next 2 minions here saw a bit of off and on play, but they definitely shined when they were used. And that is Najak Hexen and Mida Pure Light. Mida sometimes used in that like repetitive death rattle style deck, even in the times of the kind of quest Priest mirror days, getting Mida just added to that fatigue counter, or counting against it, however you might look at it. But that Divine Shield, the Life Steal, very impactful for Priest to kind of stay alive and continue in games as long as possible. So definitely huge shoutouts for these cards as well. There are also several removal style cards that I do want to talk about here as well. And these removal cards are Devouring Plague, Against All Odds, and even Condemn. We'll do a special shout out for the ranked spell here as well. But Devouring Plague and Against All Odds, in addition to that Shadow Word Devour that I already mentioned, were used decently throughout their time. Against All Odds started to pop up a bit more, I would say, in certain metas. Devouring Plague, not used in every meta, but it being a shadow spell, Against All Odds being holy, also really worked with that spirit guide I mentioned. Just a lot of potential there. And of course, if you're looking at removal, we have to look at Desperate Prayer and Xyrella. Desperate Prayer in itself, not a removal. Sometimes it was actually just used for healing, but there were often many times that this Desperate Prayer was used in combination with this Xyrella here for board clears. So yeah, these cards pretty impactful as well, leaving standard. Last special shout out for a removal card is this Lightmaw Netherdrake. Again, working on that shadow and holy kind of combination. The last set of cards that we have to talk about for Priest is this whole shadow package. Now, this is a handful of cards here, but the biggest one that really made this whole archetype a thing is this Dark Bishop Benedictus, setting that hero power to dealing 2 damage that you could target instead of 2 healing like the normal hero power. Spells all had to be shadow, but most of the time, really not a problem. That hero power, an incredible payoff for having Benedictus in the deck. This Shadow Priest really became an entire archetype on its own, going through a few different iterations over its time in Standard. And a couple of really notable cards that were used in the Shadow Priest here. We're going to talk about Void Shard and this Shadowcloth Needle. Void Shard, not used in every iteration, but used off and on, and especially in the kind of earlier metas of Shadow Priest, Void Shard, incredibly impactful. Being able to discover a spell in your deck oftentimes was enough to find this and potentially end the game with this kind of over-the-top damage. And the Shadowcloth Needle helping clear opponent boards or just deal additional damage to the opponent's face with those shadow spells at the same time, because you already wanted to be playing the shadow spells. So the Shadowcloth Needle really just added a lot of that extra potential for Shadow Priest to fight off against opponent boards and stay in it a little bit longer. And then these last ones here also used, I would say, Void Touched Attendant, used in practically every Shadow Priest deck or iteration that we've seen. Incredibly powerful effect there. And then these last two kind of saw intermittent play in these shadow decks, but that is Defias Leper and the Twilight Deceptor. Being able to use your hero power, your new Shadow Priest hero power, to hit the opponent in the face, and then play Twilight Deceptor to draw specifically a shadow spell, something like that Void Shard or something else to work with your Shadowcloth Needle. Very, very impactful in some of those iterations of the deck. And Defias Leper, again, with that shadow spell, you're already running them, being able to send that 2 damage to opponent minions or an additional damage to face. Huge, huge impact in some of those earlier variations as well. What do you think? Let me know about these classes and the cards that are leaving there in the comments. Thank you for checking this out. And if you haven't already, you can go ahead and check out the last video that I did with Hunter and Mage cards. Lots of cards leaving for those. So make sure you check that one out, and I'll see you in the next one.